strange young preacher out to start his own church in Wise Blood, a strange new film directed by John Huston. Wise Blood is one of 4 new movies we'll be reviewing on Sneak Previews. 2 film critics talking about the movies. This is Roger Ebert, film critic of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And across the aisle from me is Gene Siskel, film critic of the Chicago Tribune. In addition to Wise Blood, we'll review Wojciech, the new German film by Werner Herzog. We'll take a look at the biblical ripoff In Search of Historic Jesus. And for a change this week, we're going to read and answer some of your letters. But first, Gene starts with a romantic comedy named Something Short of Paradise.
I think when it comes to romantic movies, we're living in the age of Annie Hall clones, weak imitations of that fine film about the difficulties of men and women living together. Now, one of the worst clones of Annie Hall is a new movie called Something Short of Paradise. Just like in Annie Hall, a short Jewish writer-comedian, not Woody Allen, but this time David Steinberg, falls in love with a taller non-Jewish woman, not Diane Keaton, this time Susan Sarandon. They're oh so cute in her apartment as they play around with her telephone answering machine. Yeah. It gets worse, too, and even more cute. Later in their relationship, they argue in a hallway between their separate apartments. Yep. That's a comedy sketch, not a real-life moment between 2 people. And when the couple in this film isn't performing comedy routines in a weak imitation of Annie Hall, they argue about their individual freedoms. They're boring as individuals, and they're boring as a couple.
Yeah, the one thing I like about Annie Hall was that they were real contemporary people.
Who had affection for each other.
Who had affection, yeah. Here they seem to have been borrowing their entire personalities off of television. That could have been a sketch from The Honeymooners or I Love Lucy.
And when they stand next to each other in a shot, and you can see that it's just 2 actors standing there reciting lines that have to be well-timed so that they don't interrupt or they remember a line from before. That isn't what a relationship is about, in person or on screen. Right, we want to see these people look at each other and feel something.
Right, and in this movie, they don't really stand next to each other that much. They're always analyzing the relationship in the third person. They're sitting at home alone thinking, even voiceover, thinking, what do I do now? What do I think about this guy? What should my next new move be? Then they talk to their friends. They're always ruminating about the relationship. They're analyzing it. They're never in the same scene talking to each other. It's very distant somehow, very curious.
Very rarely,
yeah. Here's a movie that's a little more interesting, not any more successful perhaps, but more interesting. One of my favorite American directors is John Huston, who made his mark with his very first film he directed, the 1938 Humphrey Bogart classic, The Maltese Falcon. John Huston then went on to direct The African Queen, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The Man Who Would Be King, and now he's back with a very personal and unusual film, Wise Blood. It's about an eccentric Southern preacher who wants to start a new kind of church and seems to be founding his own cult as he goes along. A little overwrought there, a little too broad on the accents. The whole movie is pitched just a little too high, I think. That was Brad Dourif as the eccentric preacher. He's playing a character created by Southern novelist Flannery O'Connor, who created a kind of rogues gallery of saints and charlatans. There's a rival evangelist, for example, who pretends to be a blind faith healer, and he doesn't like his new young competition in town. Down home in the shack. It's hard to say exactly what kind of world John Huston was trying to create in Wise Blood. It's not a realistic world, that's for sure. Everybody's a character, everybody's eccentric, and half the characters are half mad, and the other half are insanely inspired. They seem to belong somewhere in that fantasy stereotype of the South that's been collectively created by William Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, Flannery O'Connor, and Mayberry RFD. But by the movie's end, we've somehow never really gotten personally involved with these characters. Wise Blood creates a universe that exists on its own terms, and sometimes it is sort of fascinating, I've got to admit that, but it just doesn't quite connect with any world we can identify with.
I want to pick on that thing about the South. When I see a picture like this, it's almost as if these directors in Hollywood and in California think they're making something significant by going down to the South and shooting a picture there and simply showing those quaint folks who live down South. Show the old stores, show the old cars, and show the old-fashioned people. That's what the real messages of these pictures are, and it's really rather patronizing.
It's kind of borrowed authenticity. If they don't really believe in their characters, they feel they give them an accent, let them kick enough dust around and so forth, they'll seem so real to us, so nitty-gritty, that we don't really ask, what are these people doing? What are they saying? And what do they mean?
I think I have a clue maybe to what might be going on in this picture. It's a tough one to figure out, and it's by a serious director, so it's worth thinking about, seriously, I guess. The preacher at the end of the picture becomes sort of a Jesus-like figure. He tortures himself and all that. And since he has a church without Christ that he's talking about, maybe the message of the film is that if Jesus were to come back and be that preacher, he would found a church without Christ because presumably Christ's message has been distorted now, and it isn't as pure a message as it once was 2,000 years ago. That's all I can get out of the picture.
I can get that out, too. The only problem is I don't know whether I'm getting that out of the picture or whether that's what the character thinks, and then the picture thinks the character is crazy. I mean, you don't really know if this film advocates the point of view of its central character or is simply looking at it in derision.
You do not know that, and that's what is very frustrating, because you end up thinking that he's just making fun of this preacher. All right, now we stay with religion for our next film. We come to a picture that's easy to criticize, but it's going to be a little tough to show you exactly why we don't like it. The film is in search of historic Jesus, one of those pseudo-documentary films made by the folks who have given us such dumb films as Beyond and Back, The Lincoln Conspiracy, and In Search of Noah's Ark. Those are great, weren't they?
Really terrific.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, as critics, Roger and I really detest the film that this company makes. It's Sun Classic Pictures out of Salt Lake City. And Sun Classic Pictures doesn't like us or many other critics. They wouldn't let us use a scene or let us take an excerpt from their new movie, In Search of Historic Jesus. It's a film that suggests in its hyped-up TV ads that it's going to prove that Jesus was the Son of God. Obviously, something a lot of people are really interested in, to say the least. But the film proves no such thing. All it does is ask a lot of questions. Is this true? Is this not true? Or could this be true? You're looking at scenes television station WBBM-TV took of crowds going to see this movie at a downtown theater in Chicago. The makers of this type of movie typically rent the theater and jack up the admission price $50, and yet the crowds keep coming. And what do people get? A cheap magic show. There's a sequence where Jesus walks on water. Look closely, you can see the ledge in the water the actor is walking on. Elsewhere, the film speculates on what Jesus did between the ages of 12 and 30. Here, the actor playing Jesus supposedly visits India and Persia in a sequence shot in Utah. This is an offensive retelling of a great story. If this film had been done right, it could have been beautiful, moving, and needless to say, very important. Instead, this is a cheaply made film that lifts battle footage from other biblical epics and calls it its own. In Search of Historic Jesus is a complete ripoff. Do you agree?
It is a complete ripoff. I do agree, and here's how they do it in their newspaper ads. What's despicable is the way the film company tries to pressure you to rush right out and see this movie with advertising campaigns that work like this. The first ad tells you the movie starts tomorrow for 1 week only. They run this ad on the day before it opens. Well, 1 week later, they run an ad proclaiming that this is the last day, your last chance to see this movie. But hold on, that's baloney, because in the very next day's paper, we see this ad. Look at this. Held over for one final week. Terrific. What do you know? It wasn't the last day. A little bit of a con game going on here, because the purchase order for this held over ad was placed at the very same time as the last day ad. In other words, when they said it was the last day for the film, they knew it wasn't the last day. There must be something about that in the Bible, Gene. The TV commercials do the same thing. The first week, they tell you it's for 1 week only. The second week, they tell you it's been held over, and they send out TV commercials for both weeks at the same time. Now, obviously, the newspapers and TV stations who accept this advertising are willing accomplices in these phony ad campaigns. They're at fault, too. But the fact remains that the public is being cynically pressured into seeing these movies by advertising gimmicks.
Designed by the film company.
Exactly.
You know what is even worse than the trickery with the ads? I think what's horrible is that these films perpetrate an old-fashioned notion of religion, and especially to little kids. Instead of stressing the human values that a religion has, this film gives us characters, a guy playing Jesus, and his hands glow. 3 wise men, and they're all lit up with neon. What does this have to do with religion?
It's like everybody in this movie walks around with their finger stuck in an electric light socket. You know, they're always glowing. Let me tell you one other thing that I liked. They talk about those missing years when Jesus was between the ages of 12 and 30. Well, that gives them 18 years when anything could have happened, and in this movie, anything does. They bring down a Bible from the shelf, for example. They say, well, this is a testament that was written in 1912. That's great. And then they show it to you, and then they put it back on the shelf. They never open it. And then we cut to a map, and they have little dotted lines going down the map, and they say, well, Jesus left Jerusalem, and maybe he went to Persia, and maybe he went to India, and then the dotted line goes over to India. But on the other hand, maybe he went over to England. Well, he had 18 years. He could have walked anywhere, right? And sure enough, in England, they show you a church, and they say, well, this church could have been built about the time that Christ was there. Well, I know enough about architecture to tell you that church is a Norman church. It wasn't built for hundreds of years after Christ was there, if he was there. But this movie doesn't care. You're just sitting there in the theater, and they say, what if he went to England? What if he went to Persia? You're totally confused, and they don't really care. Once they've got your money, they'll tell you anything.
And the worst thing about this kind of picture is that people get roped into this. I don't know when you saw it. The crowd, it was a big crowd when I saw it. People that when they get beaten like this, they don't want to go back to movies. Any kind of movie.
I think people get the point. We don't like In Search of Historic Jesus. It was safe enough to say for a long time that Americans never went to German films, and that began to change around 1970 with the rise of what's been called the German New Wave, and there are 2 German films right now that are attracting big audiences. Rainer Werner Fassbinder's The Marriage of Maria Braun, and Werner Herzog's dramatic new version of the Dracula legend, Nosferatu. And now Herzog is back again with a strange, offbeat, and fascinating retelling of a 19th century story called Wojciech. Klaus Kinski, who played Count Dracula, stars as Private Wojciech, whose private hell on earth is that he's a man obsessed with following orders, with doing the right thing, and yet his superiors are forever torturing him with verbal insults. In this scene, for example, the sadistic army captain and a crazed doctor whisper to Wojciech that his mistress, who bore his child and who seems to love him, has been unfaithful. A situation like that is clearly more than Wojciech can handle, and like a lot of Herzog's heroes, he turns to nature as his confidant. This is a typical Herzog scene with the hero at one with nature, with the sky and the land and the field, seeking some kind of earth power to help solve the problem of his unfaithful mistress. A scene like that could have really been ridiculous with another actor, but Kinski really makes it compelling. And it's impossible to imagine Wojciech without Klaus Kinski, who's one of the most extraordinary film actors to come along in a long time. He seems haunted and obsessed, ancient, and yet somehow childlike, and so strange that Herzog can give him some of the most extreme emotions and dialogue, and he doesn't even seem to be acting. I don't think Wojciech is as successful as Herzog's Nosferatu, but it is a powerful film experience.
I think you're right in the sense that you put the emphasis on the actor rather than the film or the filmmaker. We get early on what this film is about. It's based on a famous German piece of drama, which was turned into a famous opera. It's roughly about a lower-class, working-class man being subjected to all kinds of punishment by authority figures and how horrible the world is, and he thinks the world's going to end, and what's really happening is the world's ending for the lower-class people all the time. That we get real quick. When it's repeated, it's redundant. What we'll never forget and what we take out of this picture is this actor, his eyes, his haunting. It's one thing to have an intellectual point being made about lower class, but when you see this human being on the screen being subjected to punishment, he's great.
This is remarkable. This is really a case of the right actor and director getting together at the same time. Now, Klaus Kinski, who is in his early 50s, has made more than 170 films. But the first time Herzog saw him, this is interesting, Herzog was a 12-year-old boy who saw him walking down the street and said, someday I want to be a movie director and someday I want to put that man in my movies. And he's made 3 movies with Kinski, and with those 3 movies, Kinski now has become a star.
Well, now, speaking of stars, look who's here. It's Spot the Wonder Dog, all dressed up as sort of a mailman. There's the pouch, little cold weather wear for Spot. Roger and I, for the first time, are now going to answer some letters from you. That's why Spot is there. If you want to write us or the ASPCA for making Spot wear that ridiculous outfit, get out a pencil. In a minute or two, we'll give you our addresses. Okay, Roger, here is some mail we selected that we wanted to answer.
Okay, Gene, let's see. This letter is from Frank Farrell from a small town of California. He says sometimes he has to drive an hour and a half to see smaller art films like Autumn Sonata or Days of Heaven. Why can't he see the smaller pictures in town? It's probably true that a lot of the smaller artistic-type pictures that we talk about on this program do not play in smaller towns. They're not like James Bond and play everywhere. I suppose the thing to do, if you have a university or a community college in your small town or nearby, see if it has a film society.
Right.
If it doesn't, start a film society. Some of these films don't cost more than $200, $300, $400 to rent.
In 16 millimeter.
In 16 millimeter, yeah.
Another thing that he can do is talk to his local theater manager. If it's part of a big chain, the theater, then talking to him isn't going to do any good. He doesn't set policy. But if it's an independently owned theater, then the theater manager has a say over which picture he shows, and in a slow week, let's say the end of January after the Christmas pictures play a while, he might actually run a film that people request because he wants to do some business. I've got one from St. Paul, Minnesota, Stephen Marchio. He wants to know why at the end of the show we call it Dog of the Week. Dogs are such nice creatures. Why make dogs have a bad name? And then we got a postcard here from someone who wants to know about whether Spot is our own dog. Well, Spot is not either of our own dogs. Spot is owned by Bob Hoffman, who's an animal trainer outside of the Chicago area. As for Dog of the Week,
we have nothing against dogs. We just call them Dog of the Week. Actually, we didn't even have Spot when we started calling them Dogs of the Week.
That's
right?
that's just the title.
You know,
dog.
the question I got, this was a great one. Somebody said, is Spot a real dog? And I think, what do you think, Spot?
See, he holds his head motionless so much sometimes on the show that people don't know that he's real.
Spot is probably a real dog, okay? Here's a letter from Kathy LaCroix of East Hampton, Massachusetts. Takes her teenage sons to see PG-rated movies. They often have nudity, cursing, and violence in them. What does the PG rating really mean? What is it? How can she rely on it?
Well, the movie picture companies want to have their films rated PG because that means anybody can go. Lots of people can go. If it's rated R, it's restricted. So the movie companies put pressure on the people who rate the movies so that fewer things will get things rated R. Now, the things that get things rated R are one swear word specifically, nudity below the waist. extreme violence, really slashings in close-up, or a really kinky, weird subject, incest or something like that. That makes it R. Other than that, you can get some pretty foul language and some pretty rough action in PG.
Maybe what we might do on the program is with PG-rated pictures at the summary at the end. If we think it's a little extreme for younger viewers, we might mention that, right?
That's what we'll do because of Kathy LaCroix's letter.
Kathy LaCroix's letter, right.
All right. I have a letter here. Why don't you guys have a few drinks together? You don't seem like you like each other very much.
Well, we are competitors. We've been competitors for 10 years. You work for the Tribune, I work for the Sun-Times in Chicago, the two morning newspapers. So professionally, we are competitors.
Yes, I like to beat your brains out in print anytime
I can.
I
always enjoy doing that, too. But I suppose I have a grudging respect for you as a film critic.
I suppose I do, too.
Right, and when we leave the studio, we drive in separate directions in separate cars, right?
We have a drink once in a while.
Okay, right. That just about does it for this show. Thanks for your letters. And if you feel like writing, our address is Sneak Previews, care of WTTW Television, 5400 North St. Louis, Chicago, Illinois, zip code 60625. Repeating once again, Sneak Previews, WTTW, 5400 North St. Louis, Chicago, 60625. And Spot the Wonder Dog is at the same address, but he does a really bad job of answering his mail. Now let's take another look at the movies on this show. Something Short of Paradise stars David Steinberg and Susan Sarandon, and we thought their love story was a mess, so we say no. Gene and I cannot recommend that you see Something Short of Paradise rated PG. We also both voted no for Wise Blood, the offbeat melodrama directed by John Huston. It was original and eccentric, but it never quite got itself together. And two more loud no votes for In Search of Historic Jesus, which had a phony ad campaign and turned out to be a complete ripoff once you got into the theater. We both voted yes, though, on Wojciech, starring Klaus Kinski. It was a bleak and haunting portrait of a man being crushed by his society.
Well, that's it for this show. Next time on Sneak Previews, Roger and I will review 5 new films, including some of the big Christmas movies. Star Trek, the motion picture version, with the same old crew, Spock is there. 1941, a big new comedy by Steven Spielberg, the director of Jaws, and Steve Martin starring as, what else? The Jerk. Until then, write us at your own risk. We'll see you at the movies.